Thank you very much, Joy. It was good that people managed to recognize Zimbabwe and where it is located. There is one thing I will tell you about the time that I was growing up in Zimbabwe, which is that if you go to the oldest city that was established in colonial times, it is called Masvingo. There is a bus terminus which is in the ghetto within that city. And there is a school that's close to that bus terminus, which is a Catholic school. And it happens to be the school where I went for my primary schooling, grade 1 to 7. And there are many things that I loved about the school, including that we had debates that were held by the whole school every Tuesday, which was tremendous and was fun. But there is one thing that I hate and that many of my friends hate when they think about the school, which was our ugly uniform. It was, for the boys, a pair of khaki shorts and a khaki shirt. And somehow, we always found them in the worst form when we bought them in terms of what was available on the market. But there was one thing that was fascinating. On those uniforms, there was a badge that said, "Knowledge is power." And many of my friends that went to the same school, when we meet today, we often say, we now understand what that was about, because it was an inspiration that we all loved and appreciated and lived to see the benefits of. So poverty is something that SDG 1 has committed to fight. We are all committed to fight it. There is no dispute about that. But when you scratch below the surface and you say, what makes people poor? The reality is that the toxic mix of corruption, of bad governance, of discrimination, leaving some people behind, and of all those ills that our societies are fighting against are actually what is central to the making of poverty. People become poor and they are maintained or kept in poverty precisely because they often don't know enough about the opportunities that may be available for them. They often don't know enough about who is eating on their behalf and in their name. They often don't know enough about how many barrels of oil are being generated out of their economy on a day-to-day basis, and what those barrels of oil could produce by way of money and riches that could go into investment in education, health, and other such. They often don't know that they deserve better. So access to information, access to knowledge is power. And the most important way of solving the poverty crisis that our world faces is our ability to have the collective conversation that we are all able to have because we have access to knowledge, information, and those resources that enable us to talk to each other about the solutions our society needs. But then, we have seen as Amnesty a situation where just in 2016, at least 22 countries saw people that peacefully stood up for human rights being killed. At least 22 countries. In 63 countries, people faced smear campaigns for just peacefully standing up for their human rights. In 68 countries, they were arrested and detained for the same reason. In a whopping 94 countries, they were attacked, they were vilified, they were otherwise persecuted. And human rights are indivisible to the extent that human rights provide us with a vehicle into tackling poverty. And we have people that stand up and speak out. In Brazil, in the favelas, against the violence that police are meting against young black males. In China, when they say there is too much repression in their local governments or central government and too much corruption. In Zimbabwe, in my own native Zimbabwe, when people stand up and say there is no money in the banks and they are arrested, and in many other places. So, one of the foremost ways in which we can fight poverty is to make sure that the freedom of journalists to be able to practice their profession, the freedom of people that speak in the public arena on human rights issues, the freedom of young people in the schools that stand up and do what we saw in the so-called Arab Spring that opened up many societies, the freedom even of pastors, even of rabbis, even of any other people of faith that stand up among their congregations and say, why do poor people not have food on their tables, should be maintained. It is one of the most important ingredients for fighting poverty. Today, we see a lot of applause that's given to the Chinese model. I need to say a word about that. Yes, China has made many efforts to bring people out of poverty, and the contribution to their lives and livelihoods is to be applauded. Yet at the same time, we need to think about sustainable solutions to poverty. It is not enough to drive people out of poverty in spite of themselves. It is not enough to be utilitarian about fighting poverty and say, as long as we are getting you out of poverty, the consequences don't matter, even if we repress some minorities, even if we leave some behind. It is not enough to be sequentialist, as we have seen in China, about fighting poverty, and say, it does not matter that you may suffer now, it will be okay eventually. Because those things may work now, but they are not sustainable. If we are to have sustainable solutions to poverty, it matters to guarantee the human rights of all. It matters to guarantee freedoms, and it matters to regard human beings in that quintessential Kantian way, when Immanuel Kant said human beings are an end unto themselves, in the sense of the categorical imperative. I want to say two last things. We have seen today many moments across the globe of what we would really call the politics of demonization. We have seen the spread of hate as an electoral ticket for some to get into office. We have seen leaders that are actually investing in taking advantage of the divisions among us that are artificial, of race, of religion, of faith, or many other distinctions, ethnicity and otherwise. And instead of bringing people together, we have seen those leaders building barriers, sometimes in the form of actual walls. We have seen those leaders preaching hate. We have seen them excluding. We have seen them leaving others behind. This cannot be a solution to the scourge of poverty, because the reality ultimately is that we have to take everybody with us. The 10 million of Roma people in Central and Eastern Europe, as long as in all the countries where they live, we have not thought about their reality, the solutions that we bring to the table in those countries are not sustainable. As long as we have the crisis of Rohingya, which is the example par excellence today of what leaving some people behind and discrimination can do, we have not been able to tackle poverty sustainably in Myanmar. As long as we have minorities that are unable to use their right to vote, to access representation, and to be able to elect people of their choice to lead them, as long as we don't have freedom of expression, as long as information is not vitally moving around in our societies, unfettered and freely, we are not able to have sustainable solutions to poverty. And therefore, finally, it is a moment when we need to press the reset button. We need to be thinking about a compelling and powerful narrative that lifts the world to new imaginations beyond the confines of where we are today. That gives hope to our young people. That gives them a sense that it is a world that still cares and that removes the cynicism that is drawing us ever more into the vicious cycles of violence, of intimidation, of degradation, and of division. And human rights are a critical ingredient of that. The free access to information is an essential component of that. The indivisibility of human rights is an essential component of that. Fighting hate, condemning the barriers that are being put among us or between us by politicians that are exploiting the divisions that are artificial in society among human beings and creating real divisions through corruption and other scourges. If we cannot fight that, we have not been able to reset the reality of our world today. It is a moment to reclaim those fundamental values that on this very soil we saw 1789, that we saw back in the Magna Carta, even within their limitations of their time, that we saw in the anti-colonial struggles in many parts of our world, that we saw in 1965 as we set as a world community to come up with a convention against all forms of racial discrimination, that we saw in 1966 when we came up with those two instruments that protect civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, that we saw in 1979 as 51% of humanity, women, said, we are part of this, and we want a claim in this, and we came up with CEDAW as a way to protect the place of women in our society, giving an opportunity to my daughter, giving an opportunity to my sister, giving an opportunity to my friend, a female. We need to reclaim the same spaces and the same discourse of human rights. It is part of the solutions. It is the integral and most important part of the solution to poverty. In the same way that, as even we went on, we saw in 1984 that torture cannot be useful in the fight against poverty. We saw even later, in terms of our norms and standards, that things like enforced disappearances and so on do not contribute to human dignity. Ultimately, I challenge us to reclaim those values. It is the only way we can actually get our world out of poverty. I thank you.